Honourable Presidents, Prime Ministers, Lennart Meri's family, dear friends. When we met 1 year ago at the 15th Lennart Meri conference, Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine was still quite young. Fewer than 3 months had passed since it began. But even then, there were signs that Russia would not achieve its main goal, the elimination of Ukraine's statehood. The situation was still very fragile. Few the Ukrainians had managed to push Russia's advance back in north. It was still possible that Russia would regroup and return. Russian troops might have broken through Ukrainian defense lines in the east and moved deep into the central Ukraine. 1 year on, however, Ukraine has liberated the western bank of the Dnipro River and most of the Kharkov region. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the Ukrainians will liberate more of their country during this summer. The situation is much better than it was a year ago, but it is still far from where we would like it to be. It is vital that we do not get used to this war. This would be morally wrong when Ukrainian citizens are still dying every day, when millions cannot return home and many no longer have homes to return to. It would be politically dangerous too. The title of our conference is Incipit Vita Nova, so begins new life. We must do everything we can to make this new life better than the current one. We do not want war on our continent. But this new life must be better than the previous one too, because the previous one led us to war. Russia is now probably the weakest it has been in the last 2 decades. Let us be brutally honest. We need to take advantage of this situation. Russia started a war of conquest. It has killed innocent people, razed cities and villages, and destroyed infrastructure and cultural monuments. We do not need to humiliate Russia, but we do need to punish it for what it has done. As criminals are punished, so should criminal regimes too. The best punishment would be a quick and clear defeat in the war and the liberation of all Ukrainian territory. The outcome is as much in our hands as it is Ukraine's. The caution in arming Ukraine in the early stages of the war is understandable. But by now, Russia's so-called red lines have been crossed many times, and its nuclear threats have been shown to be empty. There are now no excuses for not giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to end the war. Western technology is clearly superior to Russia's. With our assistance, with our weapons, Ukraine could win this war. After which, its security and ours should be assured by accelerating its accession to NATO and the EU, along with other European nations willing to do so. Dear friends, Russia's aggression in Ukraine is, of course, once again the dominant theme of our conference. Even when we talk about the Indo-Pacific region or the Middle East, we will not be able to avoid a wider impact of the war. Difficult times force people to work harder. I'm sure we will work very hard over the next 3 days, and that the 16th Lennart Meri conference will challenge us intellectually. But I'm also sure that the outcome will be worth the effort. Finally, as always, I would like to thank all those who have contributed to the success of the conference, our partners in public and private sectors, our sponsors, and my colleagues at the International Center for Defense and Security. My special thanks goes to the director of the conference, Eva Ekpajuste. This will be Eva's last conference as a director. During the last 5 years, Eva has done an incredible job, bringing new and exciting speakers to Tallinn. She was able to keep the spirit of the conference alive even during the COVID period with the Lennart Meri Talks video conversation. And in the very short time window between the two corona waves in September 2021, she was able to successfully organize a full-scale conference. I wish Eva every success in her new job at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you.
Timothy over here. Kaja, Kallas, Prime Minister, next to Timothy Garton. You in the middle, you out here. Perfect. And Commissioner in the middle, and exactly. Well, good day, everyone. Good Friday. It is, I would just say it is wonderful to see you. Thank you, Mr. Koenig, for your opening words. Congratulations on Eva on going to the Foreign Ministry. I have been something of a regular at this conference for quite longer than I care to admit, and I will say that it is always a special time in the European calendar when Tallinn comes up. It is a time for deep reflection, often very original conversations, and I will also say a time to see old friends and to reflect on the year that has gone by and what a year it has been. And let me also say that I'm particularly touched and glad to see here Russian friends whose safety I was worried about 18 months ago because they were being quite outspoken on social media. And I am glad that they are safe and that they are not living in places where they are subject to persecution. That is good to know. We need you, and we're going to need you. So with that, let me turn to this panel, which is a very distinguished panel, and it is a great honor for me to be moderating it. We are going to talk about, we're going to set the scene for this conference, which is called Incipit Vita Nova, So Begins New Life. And the Estonians, as always, are thinking several steps ahead of everybody else. Of course, we still have a war going on in Ukraine, a war that has, I think, a lot of open questions hanging over it still, which I think we will be discussing in other panels, night owls, and breakfast sessions of this conference. But what we want to focus on here is what this war has revealed about what we need to do about the future of Europe. It's been a time of remarkable, I think, indeed surprising unity for many of us. Who would have thought that we would be doing all this together with the Americans, that we would manage such unity across the deep divides in Europe, and that we would do things we thought we would never do. I think that really is worthy of celebration. But we also know, I think, know very well, particularly those of you who are political actors or policymakers, you know exactly where the bodies lie, you know where the divisions lie, and that those divisions remain virulent and can become worse under stress. We are supposed to talk about European security in the midst of war, of strategic competition, and the increasing normality of disruption. And I couldn't have a more distinguished panel with me here. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I am now the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. We have until 6:30, 85 minutes. We will give a lot of room to audience discussion, but first off, I think I want to give our panelists a chance to answer some of the more fundamental questions we've been thinking about. And we will start, I have ordered them, in case you were wondering, not alphabetically, not in terms of age or beauty, but in terms of seniority in their jobs. I thought that was the single most rational order I could think of, and here we are. So Commissioner Vestager has been the Executive Vice President of the EU Commission since 2014. She is a distinguished expert in competition and trade. And Commissioner, we have lived through a truly extraordinary 1.5 years in which the West has reacted to a historic act of unprovoked, illegal Russian aggression with a very carefully calibrated strategy that was centered around economic containment and constraint, something that the EU is perhaps qualified to do better than it is to undertake military campaigns, but it wasn't evident. It really wasn't evident that we were going to be able to muster quite the economic power that we did, and that this would be so appreciated by our American partners and friends. So I'm going to ask you to open this conversation by telling us what this invasion, what the war has told us about economic security for Europe and the EU's role in it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for this, I think, very warm welcome to our panel. But just on your notes, I think it's really important that this is not just a Western response to the Russian invasion. We have partners all over this planet. And we keep doing what we can to have more and more partners on this planet. Because this is a time where partners can show where they stand when it comes to whether or not to accept that kind of aggression that we have seen on the Russian side. And that outreach must continue because a lot of countries, they are the target of Russian misinformation. So very important in itself. But more fundamentally, the European Union has changed. At the invasion, it was basically by the hour. Now, of course, not to the same degree because a lot of change happened initially. But it's really important, as was said when we were welcomed here, that the war on Ukraine is absolutely top priority. We have a lot of other things to do as well, but it must be top priority. And we will stay supportive of the Ukrainians till the war is won, till Ukraine has been rebuilt into becoming a member of the European Union. I think that is the crucial commitment made, and that is what the unity is all about. And that will be a better union once that has happened. It will be a more dynamic union. It will be a more united union, and I think we need that dynamic. And there's no turning back. We have basically, turned the light out behind us. There's only one way. And a lot of things, of course, is happening because of this. And one of the things that we have learned now, the very, very hard, painful way where people suffer and die, is that dependency on a potential enemy must be avoided for the future. We need to have a completely different take on the interrelationship between our economic behavior and our security, and our also the systemic rivalry that exists on this planet. So this is why we think that we need to have a European methodology, analytical framework to assess our economic security. We need to know what is risky. Our President von der Leyen said that it's really important that we do not decouple from the world, but we need to de-risk. But if we want to de-risk, we need to know what we're talking about. And here in Europe, we are basically at a loss. I don't think that we should move competence from member states, but I think we should have a European analytical framework, a European methodology, so that every member state have a European prism when they exercise national competences when it comes to economic security. And, for instance, export control. That will allow us, I think, to have a much more robust response in the future. And it will also prevent that allies can sort of pick and choose individual member states, that our enemies can divide and conquer, so that Europe is a real geopolitical actor, also when it comes to this. Right now we are discussing semiconductors, but we have quantum in the pipeline, we have 6G in the pipeline. There will be so many technologies where we need to have a different reflection. And for me, this is actually protecting an open world. This is anything but protectionism. Because without a real methodology and a real discussion, the risk is that everything becomes dangerous. And then there is a risk that we withdraw behind borders, and that will make us weaker, and it will, of course, also put our prosperity at risk. And there's a lot of role for governments in this, but there's also a role for private sector. Because we cannot just put it on the taxpayer to deal with this. I think it is important also for the private sector to discuss this, for this to be in the boardrooms, in the diversification of supply chains, in how one sees the world. Because so far we have been paying a security premium that has now been unleashed upon us. And this, I think, is very important future thinking. And I think we are ready for it. I think we are ready for starting this discussion, and we hope, of course, that our heads of state of government, they will give us necessary guidance in the June Economic Council, the summit that will take place. And from the Commission side, of course, we will provide input for that discussion.
Let me follow up on this, if I may, Commissioner, and thank you for this introduction. I will, just maybe a flashback for everyone. Remember the Trump administration, when we had a senior economist saying that America needed to decouple from the world, and that Europe and certain European politicians, which shall remain nameless, were enemies of the US. And there was a general sense that the Europeans were not just not useful, they were actually a deadweight on American strategic purpose. Now, flash forward to the Biden administration, and we suddenly find ourselves in an effort at containing Russia that is absolutely focused on economic power, suddenly find ourselves treated as peer powers, right? That really is remarkable. And I think it is something to be celebrated, and something that we, I think, tend to forget as we look on ourselves self-critically, just how much power we can muster in the economic and regulatory reign. But, and here comes my but, it is that with this new era, I think come a number of other things which to you as a Danish sort of liberal free trader must be rather more difficult. You have been called the high priestess of competition for competition policy, the trust buster extraordinaire, but we're seeing a return of state interventionism, not least in questions about how to get European states and defense industrial bases to produce weapons more quickly, but not just there. We are seeing a return of subsidies, of government spending and debt, all of which for a liberal Dane must be quite painful. How do you envisage that this tension and what clearly appears to be the end for now of the neoliberal Washington consensus, how do you imagine this playing out over the coming years?
Well, just for the record, I'm a social liberal.
Okay, that's important.
It's important for me. And second, I think there is a balance to be held here, because in Europe we have always sort of had a social market economy. So we said, well, this is what you need to pay attention to, because we want to be able to breathe the air. We want to be able to drink the water. But within these limits, go compete. And what is important right now is that we do not lose the fundamentals of competition. Because no funding can drive you to innovate cutting edge. Only competition can do that. You need the fundamental drivers of competition to stay dynamic, to stay innovative. That being said, we're in a situation where we have a politically guided transition. The first industrial revolution was really technology driven. Now with the green transition fighting climate change, everyone was in Paris. They took the commitment. It's a politically driven transition. So of course there is a responsibility also for states to fuel that, for subsidies to work as a catalyst, to bridge from where we are now for markets to take over. Right. And that, I think, is legitimate as long as we preserve that there are fundamental drivers, because real competitiveness is not built on subsidies.
Right.
They have a role, but the real competitiveness comes from the business ideas, the skilled people, access to trade, the single market in all its dynamic research and innovation. That is what is driving us. And these are the fine balances that we need, and I think it's really important in our discussion that we do not entrench ourselves, but insist that this is complicated and that we can breathe fully in a complicated situation. Because talking of China, they're also a partner. There will be no fighting climate change without China on board.
Right.
And we need to appreciate that relationships, they are complex and they are filled with not only gray zone, but very colorful situations. And appreciate that, because only then we can move the world forward.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very helpful response. I think, I mean, you're right. What we're seeing really is a recalibration, aren't we, of the relationship between the state, business, and society, and a recognition that the state has a role as a provider of public goods, right? That can't be replaced by markets or can't be just devolved on civil society. Let me move on to Prime Minister Kariņš of Latvia, who became Prime Minister in 2019. But who I've learned was born in Delaware because your parents emigrated and they went to school in Münster in Germany and have a PhD in linguistics. And I thought it would be obvious that you and I should talk about the relationship between the US and Europe. I think we are probably in this room all in violent agreement on the fact that the Americans, not to put too fine a point upon it, have saved our asses yet again, as the Americans would say. In other words, they have played a crucial role in the leadership, the sustainment, and the continual motivation of this alliance against Russia. But I will also say that I've just spent nearly a week in Berlin and at several conferences, and that both there and in Washington, D.C., where I live, there is increasingly a sense that the topic of Ukraine is getting a little crowded out by the perspective of sort of a quite frightening potential competition with China, a competition that takes place very much in the economic realm, but also takes on a sort of very uncomfortable political and military shade from time to time. So under those circumstances, would you tell us what can we Europeans do in this context to keep the US at our side in Europe?
Thanks, just a really easy question. Sort of understanding that this question would probably come, as any normal politician, I quickly panicked and I looked for the answers. And I said, well, now we have this thing called artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. And I actually typed in the question. And the interesting thing is I don't think my staff could have done much better. It says 5 things that we should think about. Strengthen diplomatic relations, promote cultural exchange, highlight shared values, promote economic ties, and foster collaboration on global issues, with the caveat saying, well, as an AI language model, I cannot say for certain, but these are strategies I would pursue. And, you think about that, and I guess on some level, that's sort of a synopsis of the state of general accepted knowledge, because AI is not clever. It's just a bunch of algorithms pulling together everything that has been written and having extrapolative ability to kind of put together something which on some level is novel, but on some very deep level is not novel at all. I would say I think we humans still have a little bit of advantage over at least this level of AI, because we can pose a question that a very literal artificial intelligence at least doesn't today, is it really the right question? Is it the case that, is this something that we need to worry about? That is it a problem, the way that you mentioned? In Washington, you're sensing that this sense of urgency in Ukraine is going in the background. China is a big concern. Well, even in my country, which is a neighboring country of Russia, the war in Ukraine is now taking a backseat in the public's mind to mundane things such as educational, improvements in the education system, healthcare, etc. Mundane, everyday politics, which on the one level is a good sign. It shows how much we have done to allay citizens' fears, but on another level, it is potentially a difficulty. Now with Europe and the US, for all kinds of reasons, also now current professional, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about how we can make this relationship stronger, because I'm convinced from the European side it's in our interest, but I'm equally convinced that from the US side it actually is a big self-interest. And if we look at sort of facts on the ground, the US is now on some level more engaged in Europe than it was before the war. Even during the wonderful time of President Trump, the US was placing more US soldiers in the east of Europe, including in our country, in Poland, in the Baltics. So it's, sort of what politicians are saying and what is actually being done, surprise, surprise, it's not always a one-on-one. But we have more US troop presence on a continual, permanent, rotational basis, for example, in Latvia and the Baltics right now, not speaking about Poland. We also, I think there's a profound understanding in Washington on the level that the US also needs Europe as much as we need them. Because if we go outside of military and security issues into the world of trade, someone will be setting the future rules of the game. And the US understands that it is not the hegemon that it was for many years after the Second World War, and especially at the beginning, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it seemed to be. And it's a question of who will set that. And the rise of China is necessitating a stronger cooperation between, we politicians always speak about these as like-minded countries. It's a clever way to try to say, to try to sum up what we are. But Europe, the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, et cetera, basically it's the OECD. It's the democratic world. It is the West, although that, geographically speaking, it's not quite the West from where, but the as opposed to what we talk about now, the global South or Asia. Although I think Japan kind of fits in that model as well. But we need, and the US needs us to work together. Now, how well we're doing this right now, I think a lot of it depends upon us here in Europe. The US has a given advantage of having created a federal union of states a couple of 100 years ago. And we have created a union of fiercely independent states that work remarkably well together, given all circumstances. The fact that the Commission actually can function and function very well in times of crises is an amazing statement of how far a ever closer union that somehow stopped, but actually when it came to COVID and getting vaccines, worked very well, thank you very much, in terms of now using the same kind of thinking of getting ammunition production ramped up in Europe so that we can provide Ukraine and resupply our own arsenals is another aspect of that. So, I mean, the obvious answers of, engaging the Americans, asking them to invest more, et cetera, these are all fine things that everyone is doing on a daily basis anyway. But Europe, I think, needs to think about how we can be a more serious partner to the US on all levels.
But, I mean, absolutely agree with you. And I agree also, in particular, that sort of living in Washington and listening to people like Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who, tooting my own horn here briefly, gave a sort of very interesting speech at Brookings a week ago, on his economic policy, which really was a goodbye to the Washington neoliberal consensus in many ways, but also referenced the European Union several times. The president has referenced the European Union in his speeches. There is a recognition that we are providers of power and of leverage in forms of competition that take place in the economic sphere, right? A strategic competition where authoritarian great powers are weaponizing interdependence against us, well, that's a game we can play too, right? And we're learning how to do that together. Nonetheless, as you say, and I'd like to perhaps draw you out on that, I think we all know two things. One, there's room for growth in what we're providing. And secondly, there is an impending American election campaign, and we all know that there are segments of the American right, of the Republican Party, that feel at least as strongly about Europe as a matter of principle as the former president did, who might be the future president. How do we deal with all that?
Well, I mean, we have a historian among our ranks, and I'm no expert on U.S. history by any stretch, but I mean, isolationism is ingrained in that country's thinking for, I don't know, probably 200 years. Comes and goes, comes in fits and starts, I would say. And right now there's a little bit of a backlash, and the fact that what used to be the right to the Republicans, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, if you look at what they are today, it's almost inverted policy. But roles are changing, but general views are not. One part of society is very inward-looking and doesn't want to understand what's going on the outside, and the other part of society understands the context that their well-being is actually quite linked to our well-being as well, if for nothing else, for markets, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no need to fall into a kind of panic or a doomsday that the world will end. I simply don't see that happening. It's in a state of flux, as I suppose it always is, and now we're at one of the inflection points. And the question is, which way will it inflect? I cannot predict, although I wish I could, the outcome of the U.S. election, because I think all of us in this room would certainly have a very obvious preference for the development of politics on that side of the pond. But what we can do is think more about what we should do on our end. And a good colleague of mine, whom we've all had interesting conversations, Macron, and his strategic autonomy, and I've had a pleasant lunch with him in the Élysée, arguing quite forcibly against what originally I understood his argumentation. He seems to also have adjusted, but at the end of the day, in a sense, we're all starting to come around to the realization that what we have, I mean, in a sense, is a full military dependence on the U.S. through NATO. It's there. Right. And the question is, while it's there, that's great, but what could we do more to make us a stronger partner for the U.S., not to decouple, but to become a stronger partner, because we and the U.S. face many challenges, among them arising China, where if the U.S. is developing a policy, we in Europe are a long ways towards having a coherent 27 member state and commission view on what China. We can all recite the little poem about what I always forget poems, but it's a partner, it's a rival, it's something else. Of course,
partner, competitor, strategic rival.
Yes, you're better than I am, of course. But this is all true.
Almost a haiku.
But what do we do with that? And how do we want to do? And so there's I think the room for growth. You cannot control the other, but you can control what you're doing. And that's where I think we should put the focus on, because I'm absolutely positive, as Putin only understands and respects power. He does not respect, and he laughs at weakness. Well, I don't want to put in the same sentence, so I'll put a pause. And now in a new sentence, the US certainly reacts and will react very well to a strong and coherent Europe. And that should be our goal, to make us into a strong and coherent union. It can be done. It is actually happening despite the fact that we've stopped talking about an ever closer union because no one really wants to hear these words. But actually everyone seems to want the results. So when we wanted vaccines, of course we wanted vaccines, and the way to get them was through a strong and united Europe. Of course we want to arm Ukraine, but it's so disjointed. Of course we want to use the same common purchasing power and coordination to get manufacturing up, to get the armaments out. So we're calling things by different names. And I don't think we should, fight with people and try to sell something that no one wants to buy, but simply continue on that path. The US will respond regardless of which administration is in power. I'm convinced of it.
Right. But I think your point is very well taken, that the burden of proof is on us, that we are worth the engagement, and that there's room there for development. And there are, of course, aspects to this in when our adversaries and rivals are sort of weaponizing interdependence against us in ways that are not just military, but also economic, or using disinformation, attacking critical infrastructure and so on, all of which issues are squarely within the remit of the European Union and its member states. Let me move to you, Prime Minister Šimonytė. You are the Prime Minister of Lithuania. You've been Prime Minister since 2020. You're an economist from a centre-right party of the Homeland Union. And when I was discussing with you earlier, you said you'd like to address the issue of this new life that our conference organizers are asking us to think about can be peaceful and how it can be peaceful. Tell us what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think now when we are in the second year of this phase of the war that started, of course, not in 2022, but much earlier, and we sometimes tend to forget it, I think it's very important that we remember. And I think on the Europe's Day a week ago, or this week actually, I think that was maybe the first time where, at least in my country, people vividly remembered what the European Union is about and what is what is the idea of the project. And because we think of it's free flow of capital and people and business and trade area and everything. But first and foremost, this is a peace project. And that was a project that ensured, at least for so many years, that the wars that were recurrent in the past will not occur again. But here we are with another episode in Ukraine, where the country that for very many years was considered by some like partner, maybe rival, maybe something, but negotiable and agreeable or manageable, or whatever word you use, actually proved that it's none of this. So now the question is, what is the risk that this situation, the war of Ukraine, actually turns into something that is that is much wider than we see now? Because some people would say this is a regional thing, not the fight between the, so to say, democratic and autocratic world. But I would be a person who would say that this is our war, because Ukraine is not just Ukraine in this war. Ukraine is us, and it only happens that the terrain of the military action is in Ukraine. And what is the reason Ukraine is fighting in this war? It is the reason is that Ukraine actually chose the values that we all worship for so many years. And it was punished for that. And it was punished by a guy who thought he can punish the country for choosing its path towards future. And this path was a peaceful European path. So now it's a little bit counterintuitive to think that and to speak that if we are here to have the peace, then we must think about our capacities to defend ourselves and our values. And this is something that was, I think, quite not so obvious for many people, because for us, I don't want to say that we have a special privilege in the region. We just have a very living memory of our past, and this is the only, most probably the only explanation why we have this thin air to everything what's happened. And we still have our grandparents and parents who were sent over to Siberia, who came back alive, who have this memory of the fight for freedom after Second World War and the occupation definitely, because even myself have a 15 years of occupation of Lithuania by Soviet Union, and for me never again means never again. I mean, I just don't want to see that happening in.
And surely that memory is triggered if you have a Chinese ambassador in Paris suggesting that the Baltic republics were never sovereign, right?
That's why it was no surprise that we reacted quite
astonishing,
quite lively to this very strange,
shocking
claim, I would say. So for us, what is I think what is important to mention here. If we want to have peace, I don't think it is achievable via the path some of the people would suggest, that let's just sit and talk and stop the fight, and let's make whatever deal on the concessions of maybe territories or something, because this is not peace. I mean, I know what is not peace. Peace is not absence of war actions at a particular moment. This is not peace. Peace is the situation where nobody think he or she can dare to challenge the boundaries that are drawn by international law. And for this, I think the only way to achieve this is to take the understanding that democratic values, rule-based order, everything that we cherish so much is not given just like the air you breathe, because even air is not given. As the commissioner mentioned, we need to take action to have the air that we breathe fit for us to breathe. So with freedom and independence and liberty, it's even more so. So it means that a long neglected issue of defense and security should become top one priority for all the like-minded countries. And here you were talking extensively with Krišjānis about US and EU bond, which is very special. But what was rightly mentioned, it's not just US and EU, but also the Indo-Pacific part of the like-minded countries who see the threats similarly. Because I think that the idea of trading in countries with a different approach towards the human rights, rule of law, independence of courts, freedom of speech, free elections and everything into civilization, if I might use this word, or into some relations, failed massively. Because what we did by this, we've built so many dependencies that are now our problem, and we were not able to achieve the goal. Because for countries like us, the integration into European Union, into transatlantic area where we thought we belong, was a very natural thing. And we benefited massively out of this, because this was the thing we wanted. But for the guys on the different side of the moon, this is not what they want. I mean, they want to exploit the things that we use, that we cherish, that they want to use it. They want to use and abuse our rule of law. They would go to European courts for cancelling the sanctions. They would want their kids to be in European universities and businesses and everything. I mean, they are using and abusing, but they never want to change. So it means that to contain, because this is rather not peace. This is rather containment of the risk that that somebody might want to challenge the borders and to challenge the international order again. So for this, we need to first and foremost, Ukraine needs to win the war with the help of ours. No news in this area.
Do you want to say what you exactly mean by winning the war?
Well, I think it is a very good question because some people are saying that Ukraine needs not to lose. Mm-hmm. So when I'm saying to win, I mean that for us, victory of Ukraine must be what is victory for Ukraine. I mean, it's for Ukraine to say what is victory for Ukraine.
Okay, but that is a slightly evasive answer, Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm.
That is a slightly evasive answer, Prime Minister. I mean, it is what every European politician says with great aplomb, but it does still beg the question of what is it, and I think we are, as Ukraine supporters, they need to make the decision, but we can say what we think ought to be the minimum.
Well, if you ask me, is it that Russians are expelled out of the country, full stop? Yes, absolutely.
All of the country?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, that is what I wanted to clarify.
And then the justice for those who started the war, the tribunal and the legal measures that we need to punish, as it was mentioned, to punish the criminal, and to make the criminal pay also for the losses that have been created to Ukraine. But this is just one part of the story. For us to be, because we know that even with the losses that Russia suffers in Ukraine, they suffer massively on land component of their army, but they still have the air, the fleet and everything, and they are not rethinking. I mean, they are claiming clearly that their posture is coming back to Cold War posture. The good side of the story is that we are on this other side now of the Iron Curtain. So it means that the agreement and the understanding of NATO first and foremost about Russia as a threat, and the obligations to strengthen the eastern flank first and foremost, but also to strengthen NATO and NATO members in terms of adding much more or spending much more on defense and security is a key, because we will have to deter, and that would be peace.
Sure. Let me ask you one last thing. We have an impending NATO summit coming up on June 11 and the 12th, July 11 and 12. We had Commissioner Vestager saying very emphatically that Ukraine needs to have a clear path into the EU, which pretty much all of Europe's key politicians have agreed on. What about the disaster that was the Bucharest summit and the map promise, which was a non-promise? Should Ukraine also get a promise of NATO membership that is actually real as opposed to fictitious?
Well, technically, one might say there is a promise because the doors are open. Yeah?
Right.
But I think what happened in Bucharest was one of the biggest mistakes that happened in this century history. We can speculate whether if the Bucharest was different, the situation now would have been different, because that would be a speculation.
You know what? Let's leave that aside. Let's leave history aside. Path to NATO membership now.
So my point exactly is that it cannot be like Bucharest, because then it will mean that Russia has a say in whether Ukraine becomes member of NATO. So of course there will be all sorts of debates about milestones and terms and dates and everything.
Okay.
This is understandable, but no Bucharest once again, definitely.
Okay, all right, I'll accept that as an answer, and I'm going to move on to Prime Minister Kallas, the Prime Minister of this country, who's been Prime Minister since 2021 for the Reform Party. And we discussed that you would like to add another aspect to this conversation, which is the two things, really. How to break the cycle of aggression permanently from Russia, how to stop this from repeating itself or escalating vertically or horizontally in the future, and what role legal accountability should play in that. I'm an international lawyer by training. I'm all for that. And this is, of course, a really remarkably unique situation. Having, I was a journalist for a while. I covered the genocides in Rwanda and the Balkans and the war crimes tribunals and the ICC negotiations that came out of that. And it is very rare in international law for there to be such clear-cut cases of violation of international law as we have seen here now. And the other thing, of course, is that that this is the first war of after 1945, in which not only have the crimes been covered in real time by, as it were, citizen forensic experts, right, and handed over to criminal investigators from the ICC. And this is perhaps slightly more disturbing and startling, but the perpetrators haven't bothered to hide them. It used to be that people tried to hide war crimes behind walls or in gulags, away from public sight. Not only have these crimes not been hidden, they have been, I think we've seen the Kremlin taking pride in them, stating their intent again and again and again, which seems to me would be a constraint on the prospect of peace negotiations. So would you give us your sense of what is possible under the circumstances for negotiations, and what role should accountability play here?
Yeah. Yes, this is a very good question because, I've been reading a lot about the Second World War, the end of Second World War, Russia's history, trying to really figure out how to cut this historical cycle that one country in the world, quite a big country, constantly attacks its neighbors and is more bolder every next time. Because there is no accountability. The leaders of Russia see that no leader of Russia has ever been accountable for anything that Russia has done to its neighbors or its nations around Russia. So the key question to me is accountability, and I here see, the short-term perspective, if I can say relatively, and the long-term. Short-term is that we definitely have to put up an international tribunal for the crime of aggression. To understand that of course, the crimes that you are talking about are the war crimes. The war crimes where civilians are attacked, which are war crimes. And they are documented. They can be prosecuted by the ICC. They can be prosecuted by Ukraine. But there's also a leadership crime, the crime of aggression. So if there wouldn't be any leadership crime, if the leaders of one country wouldn't decide to attack another country, then there wouldn't be any war crimes either, because there's no war. And hence, it is very important to really deal with the crimes of aggression. And United Nations was actually the idea of Roosevelt to end the wars in the world, so that you would have this organization. And the UN Charter is a very good document, really saying what country can do and can't do. But there's one thing lacking. What happens if somebody does? And if there is no sanction, then there is no accountability. So first, we have to deal with the International Tribunal for the leadership crime, the crime of aggression right now, but we also have to figure out the rules for the UN Charter to be able to function properly, so that we could avoid the wars in the world. And when it comes to Russia, then we can't have any stable peace without accountability, because every next time Russia is bolder, they're not hiding. I mean, if we go back, then they were ashamed of attacking Georgia or Crimea. Remember, they said that it's not us, it's the little grey men. But then everybody understood that it's the Russians that are there, and then they learned that nothing happened. So everybody knew it's the Russians, but nothing happened to them. The other thing that this year has made me think about is war, in a sense that for a small country like ours, war always means destruction, war always means human suffering. But for empires, war might also mean glory. And if you look at the polls, and of course we can discuss whether the polls that are done in Russia are to be believed or not. But these polls say that there's a high support in Russian population for the war. And if you ask, why do you support the war? It was like 40-something% of people, the biggest share of people said we support the war, said that we support the war because of glory. Because of glory. Because, for a big country, invading another country might mean that you gain territories, you gain fertile soil, you gain, you gain. And you have monuments for the people who have attacked countries and came back with more territories. And if to look great examples, then Catherine the Great declared, "I have no way to defend my borders but to extend them." Or Molotov said, "My task as a Minister of Foreign Affairs was to expand the borders of our fatherland." So these are the things that are happening. And why this international tribunal is important. If we look at the history, one of the effects of Nuremberg Tribunal or Tokyo tribunals was that the Nuremberg Tribunal, people in the world, and especially the Germans, got to know about the crimes committed by the Nazis. So these were widely condemned across the world, whereas the crimes committed in our countries, similar, maybe worse even, people don't know about them. The Russians don't know about them, and they don't have, the public or the national guilt
that is
about
a really
this.
important point, isn't it? Is that the comparison with Germany in 1945 is instructive and disturbing, and it's something that I also want to talk about with Timothy, which is that in the German case it took complete humiliation, defeat, despair, and capitulation for the Germans to bid goodbye to their imperial ambitions and their racist ideology. And having spent a fair amount of time studying German cycles of atonement and judicial review, it took us decades. It would have taken even longer had not the Americans provided the legal framework and, in fact, invented some new law in 1945 with the Nuremberg tribunals. And it was really only with the Auschwitz tribunals and the Eichmann trials in 63 and 64, the Auschwitz tribunal having been in Germany, Eichmann obviously in Israel, that the Germans were sort of forced to contemplate this on their own without an allied push. That recognition is sobering, right? It takes a great deal for a country to understand just how deeply it has fallen in terms of its commitment to civilizational values, fundamental human rights, and in the eyes of the world. And I mean, while I sympathize entirely with the wish in so many of you and so many others for there to be accountability and avoidance of impunity that we've seen in so many wars after 1945 across the world. The question whether accountability has an educational value and whether that changes how a society thinks, I think the historical evidence on that is not persuasive. Right.
So you suggest that just go on with the aggression, because nothing happens.
No.
I think.
No.
I mean, this is something we want to avoid in the world, and when aggression actually pays off, it serves as an invitation to use it elsewhere, because nothing happens to you. You only
I was
gain.
agreeing with you.
I mean, I understand, I've read the books of those tribunals and how hard it has been and how hard it is really to get to that point. But it is also hard right now to convince others that we need this. And I must say that first everybody was against that, you shouldn't push Russia to the corner and who knows what they do. Well, they are doing all the things that they can imaginably do already. So there is no pushing to the corner, but it is a message of really to the future, looking into the future as well. Not only the accountability now, but also the future. And I think we have to deal with this.
Prime Minister, I just want neither you nor this room, which is full of very opinionated people, to misunderstand me. I completely agree with you that there needs to be accountability. All I'm saying is that we will have to find out some way afterwards of living with Russia, and of perhaps in some way finding in ourselves the generosity to support social change. But let me leave it at there, leave that hanging over this conversation, because I don't want to leave out Timothy, and I'm sure Timothy has views on this, and we have a highly opinionated audience, as I was saying, which wants to ask questions. Timothy, let me ask you, you've written this wonderful book, which I've just bought, and I've been leafing through, and I noticed a reference to our common friend, and in my case, mentor, Tony Judd, and his famous book of European history, which he called Post-War. And of course, in the assumption that post-war really meant post-war, in other words, that we would not see the experience of 1945 repeated again. And I'm not suggesting that what we are going through now is like the sort of 1939 to 1945, but I will say the following and ask you to comment, and then to say whatever you want, frankly, which is that for me, as a German child of war children, the language of Putin himself, of the Kremlin, and of the Kremlin-controlled media sounds like nothing so much as the language of the German Weimar, of the hard right, of the anti-democratic, anti-constitutional hard right in the interwar period in Weimar Germany, which carries disturbing implications. I wonder what you make of that.
Well, thank you, Constanze. First of all, it's wonderful to be here, looking out of my hotel bedroom window this morning to the harbour of Tallinn across the Gulf of Finland, and thinking that on both sides of the Gulf of Finland there's the EU and NATO. That's a great feeling.
Yes.
In my book, I distinguish between the post-war period, which I describe post-1945, and what I call the post-wall period, the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I would argue that the post-wall period, which starts on the 9th of November 1989, finished on the 24th of February 2022. It's a finish of a period of illusions that we could get permanently beyond war simply by dialogue, diplomacy, economic interdependence, and all of the above. So we're back to a much more familiar and challenging Europe. But what I would say very briefly, because I know we want to bring the audience in, is that Heraclitus says war is the father of all. And in a curious way, this terrible war, the largest war in Europe since 1945, has actually opened up, in my view, a great opportunity for another great move forwards towards the goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace, where we took a great step forward between 1990 and roughly 2007, and then, broadly speaking, stalled for the last 15 years. And in order to get there, just very quickly, I'd say two things. First of all, we need to support Ukraine to a clear, decisive military victory. The only path to a lasting peace is a military victory. The illusions of the post-war Europe put behind us. I'm going to give you an undiplomatic answer to what victory means. I think our aim should be that Ukraine should liberate all its territory, including Crimea, and then be able to defend itself as a sovereign state within its frontiers. That means, in military terms, that they have in the next 6 months, if things go well, to be able to threaten Crimea. They're not going to try and occupy it in the next 6 months, but to threaten it and cut the supply lines. And we have to be prepared for the added level of risk that comes with that. Don't be scared, be prepared. They may not get there. They may not get there. It may be too difficult. Then we'll have to face that situation. But our aim should be victory, sovereignty. And to your point, Constanze, I really want to say that a clear defeat would be the best thing also for Russia. Richard von Weizsäcker gave a great speech on the 40th anniversary of VE Day, as you know very well, in 1985, in which he said, basically, guys, defeat was the best thing that happened to us. It's on the foundations of defeat that we built our freedom, our democracy, our prosperity, and so on. It's actually the Russian tragedy that that kind of defeat can't happen, because it's a nuclear-armed great power. But the maximum possible defeat leading to political change in Russia will be the best thing for Russia too. The second thing to say quickly is that I believe if we're going to seize this chance, we have to prepare actively now for the second great double eastward enlargement of the geopolitical West. EU and NATO, both. So we had the first great eastward enlargement, 1990 to 2007. Then, as I said, it basically stalled. Now, Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, all of them both strategically for the double eastward enlargement. We all know how difficult that's going to be. Difficulties in the candidate countries, difficulties in the member states, difficulties of creating a union of 36. But nonetheless, as it says in the Talmud, if you don't know where you want to go, any road is good. So that's a strategic goal. Last thing before throwing it open, Incipit Vita Nova, Dante, Beatrice. Beatrice is now Europa in this simile, another beautiful young woman. I think we have a job to do in explaining to our societies, to our public opinions, that it really is a Vita Nova, right? That it's a totally new period. Because much of our politics is still in the illusion that somehow we can just sort of fix this war and then get back to the old life, as it was before, right? Or indeed, the populist version of that is we get back to the old life that never existed anyway, right? And I think it's really important to say to our publics, no, this is a different period. We have to move to a new life. It's going to be incredibly challenging, but it's also very exciting because it's a chance to expand the frontiers of a Europe whole and free.
Timothy, thank you for that. And it's good that we have someone on the panel here who doesn't have political responsibility, who can do, as it were, the translation. But still, let me push you on one point. You were a distinguished historian of Eastern and Central Europe, have been for decades, and written a number of wonderful books, most of which I think I have. There is one sort of, you've just mentioned the populace, right? You know that we are heading into a series of key elections for Europe, the Turkish, Polish, EU, the US elections, and 3 Eastern German elections in the fall of next year, just before the American ones, in Eastern Länder, where the AfD trends in first place. How do we deal with the democratic challenges from within? And how do we deal, especially, with the democratic challenges from EU and NATO member states?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I'm in 2 key elections. Turkey this Sunday, where there's a real possibility that we will have a major shift, which will be of enormous importance, because instead of being a non-Western great power, which is quite happy playing with all the other great powers, including Russia, we would have one more Western-oriented, and Poland in the autumn is going to be crucial, because that election is winnable for the opposition. For me, the key challenge is Hungary. I mean, for someone of my generation and biography, for whom the formative experience was the emancipation, liberalization, and democratization of East Central Europe, the fact that you have in Hungary an EU member state which is no longer a democracy. Let's be absolutely clear about that. It's not an illiberal democracy. It's no longer a democracy. It's a competitive authoritarian regime. And that has been facilitated by membership of the EU is really quite shocking. And if we are to be credible in talking democracy to the rest of the world, we have to try and address that challenge and get much tougher.
Okay, I'm going to throw it open now. I presume that there are people here with mics, or do we operate? There you are. Okay, I'll go to Ed Lucas here and then over there. So please, and if you could, many people know you, but still introduce yourselves. And Ed, thankfully, I don't have to ask you to actually ask a question, but I will ask everybody who follows on you to ask a question rather than to make a comment.
Yes, so, I'm Edward Lucas, and now a politician, amazingly. But I'm very gratified to hear people laughing. But my question is about, if we want to keep the Americans on board, we have to help them with China. I think everyone agrees with that. And helping with China right now means helping Taiwan. Prime Minister Šimonytė, your country has done a great job on really pushing the boat out, so perhaps even to the surprise of the Taiwanese, how hard you pushed it. And it really earned you points in Washington. One of the European countries has done something broadly similar, which is the Czechs. So my question to you is, what lessons have you learned from that? My question to Commissioner Vestager is, where was the EU solidarity when China started imposing trade sanctions on Lithuania? My question to Prime Minister Kallas and to Prime Minister Kariņš is,
Ed,
when are you going to do the same? And
not 5 questions to every speaker.
It's one question, differently phrased to each person.
I'm still going to take Matt Breiser over there, and I will be policing this space. So, Matt. God, they always make Germans do these things, don't they?
Hello, hello. Thank you, Matt Breiser. I used to be here at ICDS. I'm now at the Jamestown Foundation in Washington. The Inflation Reduction Act, is it helping bring the U.S. and EU together because we're pursuing the same goal?
Thanks.
Or is it separating us because of concerns about protectionism? And then maybe a clarification too. Constanze, your powerful point about how humiliating Germany worked to transform it. Is that something, I wasn't sure if you're arguing we should pursue that now vis-a-vis Russia, or no, it's dangerous, and that's of course to the whole panel.
I was leaving that purposefully open. But Prime Minister Šimonytė, perhaps you want to answer the question about Taiwan.
I will try not to tell all the story, but just the major lesson. And the major lesson is quite similar to the lessons that we learn with interaction with Russia, for example. It's always the same lesson. If you try to sort of step back, then you will be pushed to the corner as much as you step back. So if you made a decision, then you must stick to the decision, and we've learned that when we made a decision to decouple from Gazprom, and I mean, we had plenty of experiences with Russia as well of the same sort, because if you start rethinking and sort of, if you're allowed to be pushed, then you will be pushed. And this is, I think, the shortest answer I can give.
Commissioner Vestager.
Yeah, well, without going into the full thing, also I was not first-hand involved. Now we have the anti-coercion instrument, that is a direct reflection of the situation, which was very complex, because the feedback, if I may call it that, was done in a very subtle way, so to speak, very effective, but not in obvious channels, which is why the new anti-cohesion instrument was absolutely needed. And that is part of the sort of the toolbox of economic security, and I think absolutely needed. On the second question, if it was directed to me, I think it potentially could do both, but we're doing our best to make us come together. Because the real good news of the Inflation Reduction Act is that the Americans has really sort of checked in fighting climate change. And that is really, really good news. Because even though emissions in Europe fell by 2.5% last year, that is almost the exception on this planet. And we're in a real emergency. And I will add that to, I think, Timothy's very poignant point before concerning the war and that the post-war period started. Add to that climate change. Also, that will fundamentally change a number of dynamics. And I think it's very important to have that as part of the equation as well, because otherwise there are important points that we'll miss. But the second thing is that it has been possible in working with the Americans to limit the discriminatory effects of the Inflation Reduction Act on cars, on batteries, on raw materials, in a different framework, but similar to what you see with Mexico and Canada. And I think that has been possible because we have the Trade and Technology Council. It is led by Valdis Dombrovskis and myself on the EU side, Blinken, Raimondo, and Tai on the US side. And that has created a framework for discussions that allows us to solve things. And the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, have also given us some homework. So how to make sure that we accelerate the transition into a climate neutral continent. Because the paradox is that there will be enough for everyone. Everyone will need these clean, green industries. Here in the US, India, China, and Africa, all on this planet, because otherwise we will not be successful. So what we are trying to short term is to prevent that the European acceleration is being stopped. And this is why we have this temporary enabling of state support, because that will serve us both in fighting climate change, giving us economic security because we're much more homegrown energy, but also mid to long term improve our competitiveness, because low predictable energy prices is an absolute key ingredient in competitiveness. So in that respect, I think we, on the one hand side, have taken the challenge. On the other hand side, we have found ways that allows us to make the most of it.
I think the more ideological advocates of government subsidies and industrial policy will have heard the phrase temporary state support with interest. But let me follow on Matt Breiser with a question that perhaps others have in this room, but I think is worth making right now, which is the other act of US legislation worth mentioning, and that has caused great concern in Europe, of course, was the CHIPS Act. And Jake Sullivan likes to use the phrase, or likes to assuage European worries about this, by using the phrase a small yard with a high fence, right? In other words, we are only going to put national security limitations, prohibitions on the export to China of a very, very narrow selection of goods that will be then very rigidly protected. That said, as we all know, I think, is a lot of these goods are actually dual use. So the notion, the metaphor of a small fence, a small yard and a high fence, is, I think, of dubious accuracy. There is a real risk, isn't there, of the yard becoming broader and broader. How do we manage this? Because this is an intra-alliance rivalry that is not just sort of threatens to undermine alliance cohesion when it matters, but also is one that can be exploited by our adversaries. It seems to me that that's a key issue for this panel, so we ought to Have at it.
Well, maybe just one word on temporary and why this is important, because it's not only important because as said, you do not build competitiveness on subsidies. They can bridge things, they can catalyst. But one of the things that we need in Europe is speed. We are just slower than the rest of the world. And this is why we want member states to take decisions between now and the end of 2025. Well, the subsidies can be paid out later if that is better or more suited for whatever project, but you need to take decisions. We need to focus on getting things done. So it's not just to limit state support, it's also to make sure that we get the acceleration needed. And also when it comes to competitiveness, absolutely essential that we get these lower, more predictable energy prices.
Okay.
And on the CHIPS Act, this is exactly why we in Europe need economic security methodology, analysis, discussion, because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about.
Sure.
And I think it's interesting for the CHIPS Act because the Americans do not have the ambition to be self-sufficient, and neither do we. But within the Trade and Technology Council, we have made arrangements. We have analyzed why we had the chip shortage. We have administrative arrangements so that we can help each other out on a rainy day and days that are worse if new shortages appears, and that we can cooperate in numerous areas. And I think that is the way to go. And also, we will not be self-sufficient. That would take, I think the guesstimate is 300 billion euros up front, if you have that kind of money. No? Not anyone? Then you have to find the engineers to use 300 billion euros. So the thing is that we need to find ways to make the most of the fact that we are interconnected, we are dependent on one another, but we need to be much more strategic about how we manage this. And that takes that we take the unity we have in Europe right now next level. I really appreciate what was said about the concrete actions that gives us a closer union, not the theoretical discussions, not whatever new treaty, but real life hands-on movement towards being better together.
All right. I, of course, as has become apparent quite a while ago, have been a complete failure as a moderator because we are approaching the end of our hard stop. I'm going to take 3 people and ask them to put questions very, very briefly, and then I will give the entire panel, working backwards, an opportunity to comment on whatever they would like to comment on, starting with Timothy. So I've got James Shaw here. I've got the gentleman over there, and I have got this user. So, James Shaw first. Why do we never have women asking questions?
Thank you. Does this work?
Yes?
Yes. I think Prime Minister Šimonytė came closest to making the point I was hoping all of you would make explicitly. Namely, that the outcome of this war will have a profound influence on the future of Europe. The tyranny of the clock doesn't allow me to explain why, but my question to you is, how well do you think this basic point is understood in Europe, and who in Europe is actually explaining it?
I thought that was what we were doing on the panel. Nonetheless, over here, the gentleman. Yes, please. And then I'm going to take the lady over there. Thank you, finally. And sorry to anybody else whom I'm now ignoring.
Thank you. My name is Samuel Racklin. I'm a Danish journalist and columnist. I found it interesting and encouraging when Margrethe Vestager said that the EU and the West, all West, will take a completely different take on future global challenges. Good, fine. But I'm wondering, why did it take a war, a horrible war, to reach this conclusion and make such commitments when it has been clear for 23 years where what Mr. Putin was up to and where he and Russia was headed.
Okay.
So what will replace the war cliches like Wandel mit Handel, Durchhandel,
and the peace dividend. To me, it looks like a major collective failure by the collective West. And shouldn't we have listened to what Estonia and other Baltic states have been saying and warning
This is a very,
for
very
years?
long comment rather than
No, it's a question. Shouldn't we have
It's quite a
listened
detailed
instead
one.
of writing them
Okay,
off as
great.
hysterical
Yes.
alarmists?
Indeed. Thank you. And the lady over there.
Thank you. I'm Daria Kalinyuk. I'm from Ukraine.
Great.
We participated in
Daria.
the previous fascinating session with Russians, and the distinguished panelists told that most of the Russian society is in big depression, and they don't know how to go out of this depression because they don't see change, they don't know how to protest, they are afraid of being killed. And Russians outside of Russia are also frustrated. So probably you distinguished panelists could recommend Russians how they can end their depression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Daria, sorry I didn't recognize you. I haven't seen you in years, but really good to see you here. That's wonderful. I'm going to go backwards and leave you to weave in responses to the questions with any final thoughts that you might have. Timothy.
So I'm going to duck that last question because we British are so depressed at the moment ourselves because of Brexit.
Who isn't?
And the second question, shouldn't we have listened to Estonia? Yes, definitely we should have listened to Estonia. That's a very clear answer. And actually, in all honesty, I'm a great admirer of the leadership that Kaja Kallas has shown during the war in Ukraine. I think you've done a fantastic job. And that's very sincerely meant. Now, to James Scher's point, very quickly, I mean, I think that's what we're all trying to do, honestly. And actually, one of the things historians try to do is to enable people to learn from the past without having to go through it all again themselves. But unfortunately, there's nothing like personal experience for really shaping people. And so here's the question. One of the themes in my book is the way key political generations have shaped the Europe we've built. The 14ers, who were shaped by the First World War, the 39ers, shaped by the Second World War, the 68ers, the 89ers, shaped by the experience of 89 to 91. And a student in Göttingen the other day asked me, do you think there'll be a generation of 22ers? That is to say, of young Europeans who were shaped by the return of major war to our continent. I very much hope there will be. I think we should try and contribute to creating such a generation. But if I'm honest, I slightly hate my dudes, because I think it's been a really formative experience in the eastern half of the continent. But I'm not so sure whether actually young Spanish and young Portuguese and young Italians really feel it that way at the moment. But I'm sure we should try and make them feel it that way.
Yeah.
Prime Minister.
Yes, so the outcome of this war defines Europe, absolutely. We all agree, and that's why we are fighting so hard. And the question, who explains this in Europe? We do. Yeah. We do, honestly, every day we do. And it is true, but what also here good friends were explaining that it's getting harder and harder because domestic political issues kick in, and the worries that we all have in our countries with different mundane topics, and this is clear that it's getting harder, and it's getting harder to explain to those countries that are much further. But again, from history, like Churchill said, appeasing a dictator is like feeding a crocodile, hoping that you are the last one to be eaten. So how to make all these countries understand that even if Ukraine is eaten and then some of the other members, then eventually it will get to them as well. And what comes to your point about the generation of 22, then I clearly see that in summer 21, I had this essay contest where our young generation wrote to me essays about, what it means, the awakening time and everything. And I read those essays, and what is surprising to me was that young people, they were like, the French or the Germans who took freedom for granted. And I was like, we have done something wrong right during this 30 years that they feel the same way, and they don't have the fear that, for example, I or Ingrida has, being a child and being afraid of that because we remember occupation. And I think that is back now. I see the worry because the history is repeating itself. The things that you learn from the history books are actually every day on the news and very close. And I think it defines the generation. And now the question is, what do you do with it? And I don't have a good answer because the Russians themselves might have to find this answer. And I'm right now not worried about the face of Russia at all, because we have to deal with problems the way they rise. And right now, our biggest problem is to end this war so that Ukraine wins and aggression does not pay off. And then we can discuss. And as you say, I agree that defeating Russia could be in the interest of Russia and the reflection for their public as well.
Prime Minister.
I don't think I can add much, but I will maybe just add one more thing on who is explaining things to the world. I think it's not only us like verbally telling, explaining, making comparison to our own history and to our understanding of the threats and region and Russia and everything, but it's also Ukrainians on the battleground who are proving every day that there is something to be worth dying for now. And this is not, this is the spirit, the values, your freedom of choice that we, in so many cases, take as obvious because it just exists. But Ukrainians know that they were punished for the choice of the things that they wanted. So they are fighting that fiercely every day on the battleground with so many people that were killed, civilians and military too. And I think they are the most telling proof of this statement.
Mr. Kariņš.
It's tough to be almost last. It'll be more tough for you. To have true peace in Europe, it would require a profound defeat of Russia of the order of 1945 Germany that would begin a process of internal change, realizing that they have been living and allowing their government to do things that are impossible. That's the only way to get true peace, is a profound defeat of Russia. Now, I don't want to go into what that would require, but I think what we have to be prepared for is a defeat of Russia in Ukraine, so a success of Ukraine in freeing its territory, but still a non-reformed Russia. A little bit, Germany in the First World War fought mostly in Belgium, was defeated there, went back home. Russia is fighting outside, will be defeated there, and unless it's such a defeat that something changes at home, we will be faced with a long-term issue of containment and deterrence. Agreed that we have to use this to move the boundaries of the European Union democracy eastward, so the EU and NATO, but understanding that unless we get to this profound defeat, we are in for a long haul of deterrence and containment that will cost our societies a lot, but in the process we will become much stronger.
Commissioner.
You've said so many true things today, and being the last in the panel, that being difficult is also true. So I cannot add to these insightful things said exactly to the point. that we need to listen better. I think it is, the situation is indeed rebalancing Europe, sort of making in itself a new Europe, because everyone is moving closer to the center, and that also goes for the Baltics and for Poland, and I think this is very important. So in respect of that, listening well. But just one thing on explaining what is ongoing. One of the many, many things I admire in the Ukrainians is how they keep showing their humanity. They are so courageous. They are so persistent. They are so brave. But you know, for instance, in my Instagram feed, they show what they do to get the stolen children back. But they also show how they rescue missing dogs and cats. And that may seem like a detail where we have discussed things of tremendous importance, but you would not believe how that engages, because that shows in a completely devastating situation, met with unspeaking brutality. You preserve and you develop your humanity. I think that is what is engaging generations, because they see that this is not just everyone being toughened up. This is someone who's fighting for not just, we say, values, but for being human. Crying over children that are being stolen. Crying because you couldn't take your dog, but someone will take care of it. And that is what ultimately will make us win. Of course, the military victory, but also the fact that the humanity has not been destroyed, but it has been actually developed. That is what is real winning look like.
So that was a very powerful final word. I want to preserve the honor of the Portuguese, Timothy. I was in Lisbon and in Copenhagen around the Munich Security Conference and was told by the Danes that they had given all 19 of their Caesars to the Ukrainians. They have none left. And the Portuguese have done similar things. And the reason why is that there was a significant Ukrainian immigration to Portugal post-1980, 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, 80,000 Ukrainians. And they've taken in 50,000 Ukrainian refugees. And the post-Soviet immigrants have learned Portuguese, have become Portuguese citizens, and are very vocal on all matters Ukrainian. And so I think don't underestimate the other side of Europe. I think there is from what I heard, there's a very strong feeling there about the meaning of this war for Europe, which I find heartening, because I do think, to James Sher, that this war has brought us all closer together and has made us understand that the narcissism of minor difference in Europe is precisely that, right? That there are bigger things at stake than our minor differences. And so I'm going to say thank you to all of you for being a great audience, for having patience with my overlooking you in the quick Q&A period. Thank you especially, help me thank our panelists who have been stupendous. And Eva, if I may say one final thing, I think that we are all 2022ers now, all of us.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the splendid panel. I just have to say that those who have invitations to presidential dinner, please gather to the buses. The buses will leave in 6 or 7 minutes, so just really we try to keep it smooth and quick. And see you again at 10 o'clock when there will be a very good night owl panel. See you then.
Gracias.